Thank you so much. So, thank you for being here. I am not as entertaining as Mr. Martin. So I'm just being honest about that. I want to thank Kevin and anyone who was working to bring us back home in 1991. And one of the reasons I asked him to say something about that is because when we think about the wars the United States has been conducting since our founding, first of all, really the longest war has been the war against the indigenous people of this country. That's really the longest war. Although there have been long periods of not shooting, there's been constant oppression and taking of their land, and we've gone through one of the battles most recently, right? But the longest shooting war is not Afghanistan, in my estimation. The longest shooting war is the Gulf War, which is the same conflict that's going on right now, because there's never been military operations that have stopped in Iraq. And what's going on in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan is really an expansion of that. So that's one of the reasons I wanted him to bring that up. And also my son fought in Iraq. So you look at a person, first generation, then second generation, fighting in what I consider to be the same conflict. The other thing I want to say about, and I don't know if I say it in here or not, but about the triple evils, is that Dr. King basically was talking about intersectionality, which has become more of a term people use today, which I think emerged probably in the 60s from black women, I believe, talking about it. So it's not really a new concept, but he understood how important it was then, and that's something that we need to understand as the peace movement probably more than ever if we're going to impact things, which gets to kind of what the gentleman, I don't think it was you, was talking about meeting people where they are. So the title, well, I hope the things I say give you something to think about, because a lot of times I'm like, what I'm going to say might not make any sense, so I hope it does. The title of my talk is Organizing Resistance and Triumph. This is our time. So immediately following November 2016 presidential elections, the conversation in the world of activism became dominated by the looming reality that Donald Trump would soon be president. What should we do in the age of Trump seemed like the major topic of discussion. It seemed to be dominating everything. We saw part of the answer the day after 45 took office, and I'm going to refer to him as 45. The next day, millions of people across the country and around the world came out for the Women's March. Some believe it was the largest march in U.S. history, with an estimate of about 4.2 million people in more than 60 locations. Before 45 won, I began to formulate how I would personally respond to his presidency. A few months before the election, I told my wife that we may need to prepare for the worst. While I was not surprised by his win, I was extremely angry, angrier than I've ever been about a political outcome, and deeply disappointed in my country. I'm guessing that most of you are similarly disappointed, and I heard how different people feel, that though 45 is a xenophobe and racist, willing to cavort with white nationalists and court white supremacists, and knowing he is a misogynist, a sexual predator, and a delusional, pathological, lying narcissist, he still won. How could we not be disappointed? Yet, as I said, I was not surprised, because I saw the national rebellion across the political spectrum on the right, represented by Trump, and on the left, represented by Bernie Sanders. Unfortunately, the rebellion on the right won, and it lost on the left. But the rebellion sentiments continues today as a powerful force throughout the political spectrum, and it is a force that demands change. Clinton too closely represented what people rebelled against. For many, 45 seemed to be an outsider and gave them hope, which I know for us sounds crazy, but that's the truth of it. His win made it clear that many people are willing to overlook despicable characteristics of that person can give them hope. This clearly shows us we must remember to address fear and provide hope as we work for peace. So let me talk a little bit more about my disappointment and anger. I think most black people were not surprised by 45's win, because we know what kind of country we live in. I'm not disappointed that a person used racism and xenophobia to win votes. I know racism and sexism are used by those seeking power to gain supporters. and that our nation is still a long way from not being racist and sexist. I think we hoped, or speaking for myself, I hoped, that our nation had moved to a place where a person could not be as overtly racist and sexist and still be president. I hoped that a person who had the Klan openly celebrating the candidacy, and I say that because in North Carolina, the Klan was openly celebrating his candidacy, and after he won, they actually had a parade celebrating it, could not gain enough support to win the White House. It was my hope that enough people in our nation understood the evil of racism and aspired to end gender discrimination so that a candidate could not stand so openly on the wrong side of these issues and then sit in the Oval Office. Clearly, I was wrong about that. 45 represents a huge failure on our part in advocating for inclusion, equality, and justice. I am hurt and angry by the failure of men, including me, to deal effectively with patriarchy, by the failure of white people to deal effectively with racism, by the good-hearted Christians who have not stood strong enough against Islamophobia, and by us citizens who have not struggled with our neighbors enough to address their fear of immigrants. From a personal perspective, my lived experience as a black person has prepared me for 45. One of my mantras when it comes to being black in America is that we as black people cannot expect white people to change. If we wait for white people to change, we'll be waiting forever. If black people want to see change, if we want to be treated in a fair and just manner, then we better be about creating that change. As Dr. King said, change does not roll on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for our freedom. A man can't ride you unless your back is bent, end of quote. This is the frame of mind all of us must have today. While the first part of the title is organizing, the real first step is to remember. After an election like this one, when such an unacceptable person wins, it's almost impossible not to feel down. And some I know felt totally demoralized, and that was reflected in earlier today. So understandably, we are in the process of building ourselves up so that we can carry on our work. And to build ourselves up, we must remember who we are. The Women's March was a definitive spark in that process. It was a great motivator and showed how much power and people we have. We also need to remember more people voted for someone else than voted for 45, as Kevin pointed out. We must remember on a personal level and collectively. Now for me, I'm a believer, and I remember I am a child of Goddess, my mother's son, and a citizen of this nation. I expect my government to adhere to the values embodied in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But no matter who you are, a believer or non-believer, patriotic or not, we must all remember that we are human beings and as such have a right to have our dignity respected and our humanity recognized. And that as living beings, we have the right to our basic needs being met. However, our identity as activists in this room and our activist brothers and sisters around the world and in the US is more focused than that. We are from a specific tradition. We look at the world and demand justice. We examine systems and measure them by outcomes. We see there is a hunger in the world, extreme poverty, homelessness, and war. We look at this and see there is injustice, and we know that it does not have to be this way. We do not accept that this is the natural order of things. We understand that this is the outcome of human choices, depravity, and indifference. And to remind us, to help us remember that we are part of a long tradition of struggle, we must look to those who came before us. Now, to name a few, of course, Martin Luther King Jr., Frederick Douglass, Cesar Chavez, Mahatma Gandhi, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul, Ella Baker, Malcolm X, Harvey Milk, Fred Hampton, Betty Friedan, Lucretia Mott, and many more. We stand on their shoulders. We have no need to be afraid or in despair. The people I have named and many more I did not face much worse than we do. Their work has given us a better life and more opportunities than they ever had. They look at us and say, you have everything you need to take on this president. You have everything you need to take on the present challenge. I hate that I called him president. I really do. But you know what? They are right. We have more tools and a diversity of allies than they could have ever dreamed about. We have in our hand and in our hearts what is needed to face these times. We have them as excellent role models to help us pick ourselves up. And when we get tired, we can remember them. They stand with us. Those who stand against us only have the history of human ignorance and resistance to change. Selfishness and apathy to stand on. That is a house built on sand. Our house is built on the bedrock of the human spirit. So organizing. I put organizing before resistance because for resistance to be successful in terms of bringing about outcomes we seek, we need to organize more people to act, which is what you were talking about. I was looking for you a few minutes ago. There are three main points I want to make about organizing. One, to bring about the change we seek, we must build a movement across the spectrum of issues. Thus, we must organize in a way that is in solidarity and not within issue silos. Again, the Women's March did a great job of modeling the intersectionality of struggles and mobilizing along these lines. Over the years, the peace movement has done a poor job in this regard. We have expected people to come to our movement and express aspiration when they have not. The reality is that we cannot expect people to act on issues that primarily take place thousands of miles away when they face hardship and injustice right here in the US. When people are worried about security, job security, police brutality, sexual assault, or simply making ends meet, it's difficult to worry about wars in a foreign land, especially if they don't see how acting to change foreign policy will impact domestic policy, or if the people asking them to work on foreign policy are not acting on issues that directly impact them. And it's not that the people don't care, because you can talk to people all the time. It's not that they don't care. It's just that, what can I do and how will it change anything in my life? And that's a fair question. So Veterans for Peace developed Peace at Home, Peace Abroad as a lens through which to look at organizing and talk about working for peace. Peace at Home, Peace Abroad is a proactive answer to wars at home, wars abroad. It verbalizes a recognition that domestic and foreign policy are inextricably intertwined and that we must work for peace in all communities, meaning all communities, to have real peace anywhere. Second, we must understand that organizing is not the same thing as mobilizing. The peace movement during the Bush years mistook mobilizing millions of people who turned out for demonstrations and street actions as a movement, when in fact it was more of a reaction to Republicans in power. Once Democrats regained the White House, the peace movement lost its energy, or most of its energy. People turned to working on making gains on issues that were pressing in their lives, which is obviously fair. Today, domestic issues of racism, sexism, healthcare, and immigration are driving organizing and resistance in the streets. Unless something horrific happens that demands current resistance turn to war, such as major military deployment of troops or a terrorist attack, the peace movement will not be in the lead. Today, we must be more about organizing to gain strength and expose people to new ideas about building a culture of peace, which means building relationships and moving outside our comfort zones. And I will talk to you more about what I mean when I say move outside of your comfort zone when I talk about resistance. But we must reach out and engage with people. We must reach beyond the converted. We must talk to people who are on the fence or thinking about being on the fence. Third, we must build a movement that overwhelms political parties. This means we must not become distracted by party politics or alienate people who see themselves as Democrats. Yes, we must point out hypocrisy and hold politicians of all parties, especially the Republicans and Democrats, accountable. But it makes little sense to alienate people because they choose to identify as Democrat or vote that way. We must lead with our values and let people decide for themselves for whom they will vote on that basis. Parties are simply tools to win elections, and after winning, move forward an agenda. Movements reflect values, wants, needs, and set the agenda. We saw during this last cycle rebellions that almost took over both parties. The movement on the left failed to overwhelm the Democratic Party. The one on the right gained control of the Republican Party. But the movement on the left continues to grow. whereas it's not growing on the right. We are in fact part of that movement. We must recognize that most of the people in the Democratic Party are our allies and partners, and that we must work together to expand the movement. I said the movement, not the Democratic Party. Expand the movement. And if the movement is strong enough, which is our job to make the movement strong enough, all parties will react to it. So now I'll move on to resistance. Clearly, we must continue to be seen in the streets and on street corners to make the wars and resistance to U.S. foreign policy visible. If we don't do it, who will? War has become normalized. When I wrote this, what I'm talking about now, the weekend that I first gave this talk, was the 14th commemoration of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. There are many people who do not realize the war continues today. There's people who think we're not at war. People have been duped into thinking the U.S. is not really at war at all. The Pentagon has done a great job at naming and marketing military operations and keeping a low profile in between major troop deployments. The U.S. has been at war in Iraq since Operation Desert Storm. By giving these campaigns different names and claiming troop withdrawals, etc., they are able to claim different wars, when in fact military operations have never stopped. 26 years of continuous U.S. war in Iraq is the reality. It is critical we do our best to keep the public informed about U.S. wars. The government is always attempting to sell us a version of reality in the effort to manufacture consent. Street actions are an important part of resisting lies and half-truths and creating curiosity so that some people will ask questions. We must also understand resistance can take many forms. For Black people in the U.S., our ability to create a world that uplifts our culture and identity apart from the constant barrage of messages proclaiming our inferiority and seeking to oppress us is a form of resistance. Instead of being a broken people, we have brought immense culture, talent, and vibrancy to this nation. If we had not resisted simply by living and creating our version of a world to live in, I would not be standing here today. So we must continue to resist as peacemakers and justice seekers by building a new world. We must help people envision. We must help people see a world of peace. Now I say that because, and Paul has on a Veterans for Peace t-shirt right there, and on the front of it is this, right? Our helmet and dove, right? People ask me when they see it, what is that? Now, I've never met anybody who doesn't think peace is a good idea, but when they ask me what it is and I tell them what it is, they say, yeah, it's a good idea, but. And then they go in and explain to me why peace is never going to happen. So that has led me to believe that the most entrenched obstacle we face is not the Pentagon, corporations, or the military industrial complex. Our greatest challenge is to help enough people believe peace is possible, so that we have the political and social will to achieve it. Thus, we who claim to be peacemakers and justice seekers must believe peace is possible too. We must feel this in our hearts and know it in our minds, or we will not be the most effective advocates for peace. I do not say this to imply that if you do not believe peace is possible, you cannot work for peace, because you can. But I know that most of us see ourselves as truth tellers who do not seek to manipulate people. Rather, it is our hope that truth will lead to action and walking a peaceful path. So I submit to you that if you don't believe, or if you're not sure peace is possible, you cannot be your authentic self as an advocate for peace. It will be harder for you to see social and political connections you would see if you believe peace is possible. If you don't believe or are not sure peace is possible, I suggest you work on preparing yourself to be the most impactful and effective peace advocate you can be by gaining the knowledge that will help you understand that peace is actually possible. Just as I had to train and prepare for war, we must prepare and train to be peacemakers and justice seekers. Just as soldiers must believe in her cause, we must believe in our cause to win, especially when there are so many voices telling us daily we are wrong. Part of our organizing in itself is resistance. Returning to the phrase, moving outside your comfort zone, the most effective way we can bring new people closer to our position and begin to shift our culture is to be emissaries or prophets of peace. We must go into unusual places and talk to people we really don't want to talk to. Yes, We should have conferences and we should do things like this to educate and uplift ourselves. But we need new people, okay? We must meet people where they are. We must take ideas and conversations to places where they would not usually be heard. And when we go, we do not go to convince and argue, right? We go to engage. We go to plant seeds. If we go to talk to Rotary, Optimist, and Lions clubs, the lawyers, guilds, the accountant associations, and even the young Democrats, once we start a conversation, believe me, it will continue. But if we don't start it, it won't happen. So that's why we have to do it. We must help people see peace as possible, both at home and abroad. We must spark a national conversation about peace and justice, and we can do it if we move outside our comfort zones. Get uncomfortable and go to places we have never been. I challenge you to take this step in the name of peacemaking and justice seeking. Also, if we look around this room, we're getting a little older. And when I first got myself involved in the peace movement, I wasn't exactly the youngest person, but I was the youngest person, right? And I'm still one of the youngest people. That's a problem. But as older people, we have certain cachet that a lot of younger people don't, right? So once again, we can go to some places that other people can't go. And it's harder to get out on the street as you get older. So that's okay, because you can be in the struggle in a different way. But you're going to have to do something different, which means go talk to people that you haven't talked to before. So don't feel bad if you can't get out in the street, but feel bad if you're not going and talking to people. And okay? Triumph, this is our time. We are in a global struggle with those who believe in war and violence. We are engaged in a confrontation with those who see people as commodities and interchangeable parts to be used and thrown away to gain profit and power. Children around the world, like my granddaughter and your children, all deserve a shot at a happy life. The gangs in St. Louis, Chicago, New York, LA are really no different than the militias in Libya and West Africa, except groups like Boko Haram and ISIL are political minded and have focused their anger and energy on confronting governments, while the gangs here are more about economy and making money. But the mostly young men are the same, searching for meaning, purpose, and sustenance. The men in those militia, like the men in the Bloods, the Mexican Mafia, and the KKK, need jobs and education and seek self-worth. The same global economic forces that push these men in the lives of violence here at home create gangs around the world. In the long run, I believe we will win. We have justice and the human spirit on our side. I believe the human spirit yearns for freedom and will not stop struggling until we reach that mountaintop. And what does freedom look like? Of course, I'm not sure, but I imagine it looks like our living with each other without indifference and unafraid. To quote Nelson Mandela, for to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others, end of quote. At the least, this is what freedom looks like. We get there by keeping up the struggle, engaging with others as emissaries of peace and justice, and envisioning together what a peaceful and just world looks like. Envisioning together what a peaceful and just world looks like. We must know for ourselves and help others believe peace is possible in their communities and foreign lands. Now, there is a quote that comes to mind when I question the importance and outcomes of my activism. It is usually attributed to Dr. King, but it seems was first outlined by Theodore Parker in 1853. Parker was a Unitarian minister, prominent American transcendentalist, and slavery abolitionist. Quote, look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eyes reach but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. But from what I see, I'm sure it bends towards justice. Now, I like this. I really love this part of the quote. Things refuse to be mismanaged long, which is what's happening right now. Mismanagement. How long is a different question, but not too long, right? I believe this to be true, but I also believe the arc does not necessarily bend by itself. Our activism is part of the forces that work to bend the moral universe. Those we struggle with are attempting to bend it in a different direction. It is our charge to bend it towards justice. It is our time to act. We decide the direction of this nation and world by what we do or what we fail to do. Our triumph comes in the bending of the arc. Thank you.